Devin Golden of Mesothelioma Guide here for another Mesothelioma Guide podcast. Today I'm joined by Carl Jewett, a 24-year Navy veteran who held the title of Lieutenant Commander and is now a Veterans Advocate and Veterans Affairs Claims Agent with Mesothelioma Guide. There are likely many other titles and descriptions to describe Carl, but if I missed any, Carl, please fill in the gaps, and also welcome and thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So yes, please fill in some of those gaps. I know there's probably a lot of titles and a lot of other parts of your history and parts of your military history that I've missed and glossed over.
Right. Yeah. Okay, well, to kind of give you the Reader's Digest version, I joined the Navy right out of high school. I was an electronics technician, volunteered for the submarine force after I got picked up for the nuclear power program, and served on 3 different fast attack submarines. I got picked up for an officer program and went back into the submarine force for another 12 years as an officer, serving in various engineering billets and teaching billets. And then after I retired, I became a VA accredited claims agent. And since about 2008, I have been specializing almost exclusively in asbestos-related VA claims. So I do some other VA claims for some veterans that contact me for assistance, but the bulk is really just working with patients who have asbestos diseases like mesothelioma and asbestos lung cancer.
So let's jump into that word, asbestos.
Okay.
Asbestos in the military. Why was it so prevalent? Why do former military members, veterans, develop mesothelioma so often? Again, the stats are at least a third, probably closer to half of mesothelioma patients are veterans, which links to the fact that asbestos must have been used a lot in the U.S. military. Why was that?
Well, asbestos is a great mineral when it comes to its capabilities of resisting heat. It's a great insulator. It's great for fire protection. It's very robust, and frankly, it does a great job of what the military used it for. So, you can imagine every pipe in every one of our ships was insulated with asbestos, and we used it for gaskets and valve packing materials and hull insulation, and it's also found in all kinds of other non-military applications as well. Think about floor tiles and ceiling tiles and joint compounds, drywall, shingles, siding. This stuff was used everywhere where fire protection or insulation was a requirement, and the military has a lot of those applications. And so we have a lot of veterans who were exposed to asbestos while they were in the military, especially Navy and Coast Guard, because of the close confines of a ship and the extensive use of asbestos throughout that ship to insulate various components.
Knowing what you know now about asbestos, the dangers of asbestos, how prevalent it was in the U.S. military, did you know when you were on active duty, when you were in the Navy, did you know that asbestos was basically everywhere, that you were being exposed regularly? And did you know that it was dangerous?
I don't think most of us did. It wasn't really talked about that much. I don't remember ever having a discussion about, does this have asbestos in it? When you're 18, 19, 20 years old and you're working in the Navy and the chief tells you to go do something, you go do it. And so you may have had a lot of I think older veterans who served in the 40s, 50s, 60s, maybe even into the 70s, who knew that they were working with asbestos, but simply didn't know that it was dangerous because nobody had told them that it was dangerous. And certainly the asbestos industry had not told us in the military that this is dangerous material and you should be using special precautions like breathing protection for it. So it wasn't really something that was talked about unless you were an actual asbestos worker. And so I think that a lot of your mechanics and your boilermen knew that they were working with asbestos. It was part of their training that they had to use asbestos in certain applications. But in terms of the dangers of it, no, I don't remember having any conversations about that until after I'd gotten out of the military.
Is it scary thinking about that? Knowing because mesothelioma takes 20 to 50 years.
Well, you're never out of that.
That's a tough question to think about. Especially.
Right. You're never out of the woods. There's no point at which you can say, well, I made it this long since I was exposed, so I'm not going to have to worry about getting an asbestos disease. So that never happens. There's no end point there.
Yeah.
So is it scary? Well, I'm not going to lose sleep over it.
There's nothing you can do about it.
There's nothing I can do about it, right? Other than get regular checkups and have my doctor check me for any kind of an asbestos disease, like a chest X-ray.
But for some people, not being able to do anything about it is somewhat unsettling. Like, that's an unsettling thing to think about for some people, right? Like, some people, that is unsettling to know that there's nothing they can do about it, and this could come and they're helpless.
Sure. And I talk to people who are very concerned that they, are going to develop something, or they're starting to have some symptoms, and they think, is this mesothelioma? Have I developed something that is cancerous as a result of my exposure to asbestos? But you have to remember, it's a rare disease.
Mm-hmm.
It only affects about 3,000 people a year in the United States, which is a tiny fraction of the population. Even compared to the number of us that were exposed to asbestos. There are probably millions of us that were exposed to asbestos who never developed mesothelioma, and much more likely would develop something like asbestosis or pleural plaque, which are non-malignant forms of asbestos diseases that either cause scarring in the lungs or the lining around it, but don't actually constitute cancer or actually even lead to cancer.
Let's specifically talk now about the people who do contact you and who you do speak with and work with who actually have mesothelioma, not just people who are talking about symptoms and talking about, I might have this, I was exposed for this many years, I don't know, I'm scared. Your role as a VA claims agent and veterans advocate, explain that. What is it that you actually help veterans with mesothelioma with? What are the specifics of how you help them?
Most veterans that contact me are looking to find out if they are eligible for a VA benefit, a monetary type of compensation. Some are looking to get into the VA healthcare system because they just don't have a good private health insurer, or they don't have any insurance at all. And so VA healthcare looks like it might be something they could try if we can get them into it. You can't just get in now because you're a veteran. That's a misconception. That changed in 2003, where Congress changed the law so that you couldn't get into the VA healthcare system just because you're a veteran. Now you have to have a service-connected disability, you have to meet their income thresholds, or you have to fit into some kind of a special group, like having been exposed to Agent Orange, for instance. But most people are contacting me because they know that the VA has programs to compensate them as a veteran, either if it's service-connected or if it's not service-connected. And the big difference is that if your condition was caused primarily by the military, then you're entitled to disability compensation. Disability compensation is not means tested. A lot of veterans have been told, I'm not entitled, I've already looked into it, I make too much money. But a lot of veterans are under the impression that they're not entitled because they make too much money, but disability compensation for service-connected disabilities is not means tested and has absolutely nothing to do with how much money you make or what your assets are. Pension, on the other hand, is for non-service connected disabilities. You have to be a wartime veteran, but it's also means tested. And that's the benefit that a lot of veterans have been told you don't qualify for, and they just assume that means everything, and it doesn't. So if you're a low-income wartime veteran who has a non-service connected disability that's 100% disabling, you may qualify for pension if your income is low enough. But disability compensation does not work that way.
And that's specifically for people who their asbestos exposure and the asbestos exposure connected to their diagnosis was from their military service.
Well, the way the VA looks at it is the VA asks themselves, is this a service-connected disability? And when you're talking about a disease that is caused by exposure to a substance like asbestos, how do you determine that? And the way the VA primarily does it is they ask themselves, based on the veteran's background and his or her exposures to asbestos in the military, when contrasted with their civilian occupation, do we believe that the military had at least a 50% chance of causing this disability? So what it really ends up boiling down to is, can you convince the VA that at least 50% of your occupational exposure to asbestos occurred in the military compared to your civilian jobs? So if we can convince the VA that at least 50% of the veterans' occupational exposure occurred in the military, the VA is going to consider that service-related and approve their claim.
A veteran with mesothelioma gets in touch with you. What's the first question you ask them?
The first question I ask them is, what type of mesothelioma do you have? Because there are some that the VA acknowledges as being strictly asbestos-related. That would be pleural mesothelioma and peritoneal mesothelioma if it's malignant. But there are non-malignant forms of mesothelioma, such as papillary cell type and multicystic cell type. And the VA is not going to consider those to be asbestos-related because they're not actually malignant. They're not cancer. So if the veteran has malignant pleural or peritoneal mesothelioma, then we know that the VA is going to simply concede that that's an asbestos disease. And now the only remaining question as to whether it's service-related is can we write a letter? And I help veterans do this all the time, and I have lots of examples that I provide to them that have already been written by another veteran who did a similar or even identical job to them in the military. And this letter has to outline what they did in the military, what they were exposed to that had asbestos in it, how long they did that job, what the duration was, how significant was the exposure. We go into all those details, and then we write a paragraph or two about their civilian jobs, both before and after the military, and explain what those jobs entailed and whether they had any asbestos exposure. And veterans typically don't know that much about the VA disability compensation or pension system. Mm-hmm. And so one of the first things I do is I educate veterans about what the options are, what those eligibility criteria are, and then assist them in trying to determine whether it makes more sense for them to file a disability claim or a pension claim. Once we figure that out, then for disability, especially since most veterans that I assist are filing disability claims because they believe that the majority of their exposure was in the military, I get them the appropriate paperwork, and that can be a nightmare, as you can imagine, if you're trying to do this on your own.
That's the question I wanted to ask. It seems like filing a VA claim on your own is difficult, time-consuming, arduous, and not impossible, but it's just meticulous, versus having someone like you who knows what the VA wants, who knows every step of the process, who can do a lot of this legwork. You must have heard horror stories of people trying to do this on their own, and they just can't.
Absolutely. And I find a lot of people that will come to me after they filed their claim and either been denied, mm-hmm. or the VA keeps asking them for additional information and they don't know what to provide. Mm-hmm. So here's one interesting fact about how difficult it can be for veterans trying to do this on their own. The disability application form itself is only about 4 pages long. Mm-hmm. Preceding that are 6 pages of instructions. Mm-hmm. It can be completely overwhelming. I don't even provide those instructions to veterans because I already know what the instructions say, and I know what other forms or documentation that we're going to have to submit for a veteran's claim. So I don't overwhelm them with every possible form and every possible situation that they could be faced with. And you take one look at these instructions and you just get overwhelmed. So I try to minimize that by giving them only what they need, walking them through exactly what they're going to need to fill out and what they're not going to need to fill out. I helped them to write this letter to make it a lot easier for them to explain to the VA how they were exposed and how they believe that the majority occurred in the military. I also make sure that they get all the supporting documentation, which means copy of their discharge paperwork, copy of marriage license if they're married, all those pertinent medical records. I have a lot of veterans that will send me 200 pages worth of medical records that I have to go through to pare it down to the 30 or 40 pages that are actually pertinent. And I take that burden off them as well. So you can imagine if you're trying to do all that on your own and you don't know, what other forms you may need, what other supporting documentation you may need, you're really kind of taking a shot in the dark. And so what I try to do is just make it as easy as possible on them so that I give them the minimal amount of work to do, the minimal amount of forms to fill out, and try to make their lives as easy as possible in getting this done. And most veterans tell me that once we get done, that they thought it was a whole lot easier to do than they had originally thought when they went into it.
What are some of the questions for the first questions that veterans ask you when you're talking to them and you're explaining the process and you outline the process to them and you tell them what it's going to entail? What's one of the first questions?
Well, I think most of these are based on misconceptions that veterans have. And so they'll ask me, does this mean that I have to use the VA healthcare system? And the answer is absolutely not. Mm-hmm. If you qualify for disability compensation or pension, you can get into the VA healthcare system and use that if you want to, but you're absolutely not obligated to do that whatsoever. Other things that veterans will ask me is, how much am I going to get? And with pension, as I mentioned before, it's means tested. So it's going to be predicated on what your income level is. So it's going to vary for every veteran that qualifies. Disability compensation is different in that if you have mesothelioma or lung cancer and the VA approves your disability claim, they're going to have to award you a 100% rating because the VA has a variable rating scale of disability ratings anywhere from 10% up to 100%. And they do it in 10% increments. But for cancer, they have no choice but to award you, at least for lung cancer and for mesothelioma cancer, they have no choice but to award you a 100% disability rating.
Why is that? Do they set that rule, or
the VA sets that rule? It's based on a document called the 38 CFR rating guidelines that the VA has, And it's simply a matter of what's printed. If you look up pleural or peritoneal mesothelioma in the rating guide, it says 100% is the rating that you award the veteran. It is possible to get less than a 100% rating for mesothelioma or asbestos-related lung cancer. And it is only after the patient has gone 6 months with no treatment because they have no signs of cancer. So let me give you an example. Say a lung cancer patient files his disability claim and is approved. And he's drawing 100% disability, which for a single veteran is just over $3,100 a month, and for a married veteran is a little over $3,200.
There's set amounts. There's set amounts based on your which dependents you have, your marital status, etc. Yeah.
Right. If you're married, then you get a slightly higher amount. If you have dependent children, you'll get even more. If you're in need of something like aid and attendance, where someone has to help you with daily tasks, you can get even more money. But the bottom, the absolute bottom of the pay scale that you can get if you have a 100% rating is about $3,106 a month.
Which is helpful for answering the question of how much I'm going to get, because you can actually tell them.
Right. If they have if they have an asbestos lung cancer or mesothelioma, I can say this is the exact dollar amount you're going to get based on your marital status and your physical status and something like that. In terms of when you might not receive a 100% rating, typically the way that would happen is a lung cancer patient is drawing 100% disability. Has surgery, they remove the cancer and say part of a lobe of the lung, do some chemotherapy, and they see no more cancer. And so at that point, they say, we're just going to watch you and maybe do a CAT scan or something every 3 months or something. Well, if you've gone more than 6 months since you've had any treatment, the VA could potentially call you back in to get a reevaluation. And if they see that you have not had any treatment for 6 months, they're going to take your 100% rating for the cancer down to zero. They're not going to pay you 100% disability compensation when you don't have that cancer any longer, even if it's dormant or it's expected to come back. That's a point of consternation, I think, with veterans and some mesothelioma doctors alike, is that this isn't really a curable disease. It's like, well, that may or may not be true. There are certainly people who have survived more than 5 years and would be considered cured, but there's not a lot of them. So a lot of veterans with mesothelioma will say, well, this is not a curable disease, and that's really not relevant as far as the VA is concerned. All they care about is, are you still battling cancer? Do you have signs of cancer? And if the answer is no, and you haven't had treatment for 6 months, they're going to take your rating down to zero, and then they're going to give you a rating based on what they call residuals. Those are the residual effects of either your disability or the treatment of it. So in a case where a veteran has had part of a lung removed, obviously they're going to have a reduced lung capacity. They may suffer up from other secondary disabilities as a result of the surgery that they had, or chemo, or who knows what. The VA is then going to rate those. And so it is possible for a patient to then have their 100% rating reduced down to 50%. The key is, if the cancer ever shows itself again, all the veteran has to do is provide that medical evidence to the VA, and the VA is going to take their rating right back up to 100% based on the test, the date of the test that demonstrates that the cancer is returned. So that's the only caveat, where you could be a mesothelioma patient or an asbestos lung cancer patient drawing disability from the VA at less than 100%.
What are some of the most common misconceptions about the VA, about filing a VA claim, and ones that you often deal with that patient or that veterans bring to you whenever they get in touch with you? You've already talked about disability compensation and pension, and then kind of the confusion with that, how pension is means tested, and a lot of veterans get that confused with disability. They think that because it's means tested and they make a certain amount, that they can't even qualify for disability compensation. It's not true. Is there anything else? Any other common ones?
One of them is that anytime someone mentions VA benefits, that what they mean is VA healthcare, and they don't want that. They've got their own private health insurance.
Yeah.
And so I try to make sure they understand that if you've got your own private health insurance, then, go to a civilian physician. If all you have is VA healthcare, well, then there are some civilian mesothelioma specialists who have created programs at their respective VA hospital that we can get you to. Or we can get the local VA hospital to refer you out to a civilian expert as well. So there are some options there. But if they're resistant to talk about VA benefits because they don't want VA healthcare, I make sure they understand, no, there are other benefits like disability compensation and pension that you may be eligible for and actually be compensated from the VA. Another misconception is that they see these veterans coming back from wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and feel like, well, those guys are really the ones that are deserving. Why, I don't want to file, and I have to make sure they understand this is not a zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like if you get approved, some poor GI coming back from war who lost a leg isn't going to get approved.
Yeah, there's no ceiling for this.
No.
Yeah.
Other big misconceptions are that a veteran can't file for something like disability or pension because they are too old, or they're already retired, or they've stopped working.
Mm-hmm.
And while technically disability compensation is intended to compensate you for lost wages, the reality is it doesn't matter if you're working any longer. The VA's attitude is, if you wanted to work, you can't because you have a service-connected condition.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're eligible regardless of your age, your employment status, whether you're drawing Social Security. None of that matters. The only thing that matters in a disability claim is, are you suffering a disability that was at least primarily caused by your military service? And that's it.
How long does it usually take to go through the whole VA claims process? And once you file, or maybe even like from once you file, or maybe you start it once you get approved, how long does it take to get your first monthly payment?
Okay, great question. Traditionally, it has taken 8-12 months to get a disability claim, for instance, through the system. Pension claims are usually easier because they're means tested, so as long as you meet the income limits, you can get approved fairly quickly. But with disability compensation, there's a lot of analysis and a lot of document gathering that has to go on for the VA to be able to make a decision on that. So traditionally, it's taken a long time for the VA to gather all the information and all the documentation that they need to make a decision on your claim. It's called the development of a veteran's claim. Well, in 2010, the VA came up with a new type of claim to try to expedite some of these claims through the system. That claim's called a fully developed claim. And the idea is, as your veteran service representative, I know what documentation and information the VA is going to need from you in order to make a decision on your claim, and we will develop the claim for you.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can provide the VA with all of the medical documentation and all of the supporting documentation and the information about your exposures to asbestos, along with the appropriate forms, they're not going to have to ask you for any of that information or go get any of those records. And therefore, your claim can bypass the development stage, which saves a lot of time. Right now, fully developed claims and the amount of time it takes to get a fully developed claim approved still varies by state, but nationally, the average is around 4 months.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I do is try to explain to veterans that we can get a decision much faster if we spend a little bit more time on the front end gathering all these documents and gathering these medical records. Because if you ask the VA if you authorize the VA to go get your civilian medical records, that's going to take time. Whereas if you can just go down and get them and we can provide a copy with your claim, that's going to cut out a lot of development time that would otherwise have to be done by the VA. So I try to help veterans get all that documentation so that we can save a lot of time on the back end by spending a little extra time on the front end. Once we submit the claim, then it's up to the VA. The VA still has to get your service record from the National Personal Records Center in St. Louis. They have to get your military medical record. They're required by law to go through these. And so there's nothing much you can do about that. But once they have those, then there's no impediment to getting it onto an actual VA rating representative's desk at the VA to actually go through it and make a decision. Now, in terms of the first payment, the way that the system works is the VA, once you file your claim, the VA establishes what is called an effective date of claim. And the effective date of claim determines when you're going to get back paid. Mm-hmm. So veterans will ask me, well, are they going to pay me based on when I'm approved? Are they going to pay me based on when I filed the claim? Or are they going to pay me all the way back to when I was diagnosed?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the answer is typically they're going to back pay you based on the date that you filed your claim. They back pay you based on the first day of the month after your effective date. So let's say it's February and you file a claim and your effective date of claim is in February and they approve you. March 1st will be the start date of your benefit. Mm-hmm. They pay 1 month in arrears. So your first check that you would be eligible for would then be April 1st. Mm-hmm. So however long it's been that they've been working on your claim, once they approve you, they're going to have to give you all of those back pay checks.
If I was the spouse of the veteran who is still alive, would I be able to file a claim on my spouse's behalf?
Well, you can't technically file on his behalf or her behalf.
And you can ask the same question if I'm a child of a veteran, grandchild, etc.
Right. I mean, I work with a lot of spouses and adult children and nephews and nieces and you name it, because the veteran is dealing with cancer and has, a lot better things to do. And so if I can find someone in the family who can spearhead,
or just doesn't want to do it. I imagine some of them just are just not really
True.
a fan of it. And it's their family member who's kind of pushing and getting that information from you. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. The veteran is like, look, I don't want to have to deal with that.
Exactly.
And it's like, well, that's fine. If you can just go ahead and get the information from them and get documentation for them, we can reduce the burden on them to almost nothing but signing the actual application paperwork.
So they have to just sign it, but the family member or the loved one can do a lot of the legwork.
Absolutely. In fact, a lot of family members will simply send me a veteran's DD-214, his discharge paperwork that has a lot of the information that needs to go into the application, and I'll just fill it out for them.
Yeah.
So I'll do as much or as little as is necessary to try to help a family member out in getting the paperwork filled out for their loved one who's the veteran. So we can have a family member spearhead the entire thing and simply make sure that the veteran signs it when it's completed.
Okay. Filing a VA claim could lead to other questions about other compensation options. And specifically, we're talking about taking legal action because asbestos exposure is tied to specific corporations that were involved in producing, selling asbestos, using asbestos, that some of these companies knew asbestos was dangerous, hid that information from the public, put a lot of people in danger, and those malicious actions are, at the very least, a significant part of why so many people have, and veterans have, mesothelioma, and why the U.S. military had that substance in all of their ships, barracks, etc.
Right.
How do you bring up those types of topics? Filing a lawsuit, filing an asbestos trust fund. You can even explain what an asbestos trust fund is, because I imagine a lot of veterans don't even know what that means.
Sure. Now, it is possible for a disability claim that you file with the VA to have a negative impact on your legal claim. And so it does matter what you tell the VA in terms of your exposures.
Mm-hmm.
So when veterans have a lawyer who is representing them, and we're filing a disability claim, I will tell them, before you take this letter that details your exposure history and send it to the VA, get your lawyer to read it and approve it.
Mm-hmm.
Because you could be saying something that may, in fact, be factually inaccurate. If a veteran was to actually say to the VA, I didn't have any exposure when I was at that civilian job, first of all, you can't know that to be true for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And it may turn out that your lawyers, investigators are going to go figure out that you did have some exposure. You just didn't know that that particular product or material was made out of asbestos at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we will typically do is have the lawyer read it and say, this is not a problem, or I don't think you can say this. I think you need to change the wording on this to make sure that you're basically making the same case.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that veterans, understanding that they have to convince the VA that 50% or more of their occupational exposure was in the military, want to really beef up and talk about the extent to which they were exposed to asbestos in the military and potentially downplay any known exposure that they had in their civilian job. And you can imagine if you do that too much, it's going to be to the detriment of your legal claim. And your lawyer could say, you're literally saying things to the VA that are not in line with the legal case that I'm making about an exposure you suffered in a civilian setting. You can't have it both ways.
Mm-hmm.
So we like to make sure that what we're saying to the VA matches what the lawyers understand that veteran's exposure to be, so that your VA claim does not somehow negatively impact your legal case. And so one of the problems that I deal with often is that a veteran's lawyer will tell them, don't file a VA claim. You're not going to get approved, or it's hard to get approved, or it's simply going to have a negative impact on your legal case. Well, if the reality is that the veteran didn't have more exposure in the military, then we shouldn't even be filing a disability claim in the first place. But if clearly the veteran had more exposure in the military than his civilian jobs, then we should be filing a disability claim. We simply need to make sure that we allay any of the concerns that the veteran's lawyer may have by getting their input and their approval on what the veteran is saying to the VA, so that the lawyer knows what that veteran is going to tell the VA. and make sure that it's not going to become problematic on the legal claim.
Okay. Once you have gone through the process and explained the process for filing a VA claim, and maybe even at the finish line of that, how often do you bring up the topic, if they don't have a lawyer already, of taking legal action, hiring a lawyer, filing a lawsuit, filing an asbestos trust fund claim? Is that something that is within your how you help veterans?
I normally simply ask veterans if they've hired a lawyer already to file their legal claims, because if they have, we need to get their lawyer to review their exposure summary letter before we submit it to the VA.
Yeah.
If they haven't hired a lawyer already, then what I usually tell them is we simply need to make sure that we are not saying anything too definitive about a lack of civilian exposure.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, your inclination might be to say, I didn't have any exposure when I worked for that company. You should probably only say that you're not currently aware of any exposure right now, so that if you do hire a lawyer in the future, you haven't hamstrung that lawyer by telling the federal government that you didn't have any exposure in a particular job. Again, you can't possibly know that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And you really only need to talk about what you know. So if you know you're exposed in a civilian job, you need to discuss that with the VA and explain the extent to which you were exposed. If you don't know of any exposure, that's what you should probably tell them, so that if you do hire a lawyer in the future, all you've said to the federal government is, I don't know of any exposure that I had in this job. Clearly, if your attorney is able to uncover some exposure, then it's easy to argue that, well, my client simply didn't know about that exposure at the time they filed their VA claim, and it shouldn't be a problem.
Last question. This is one of the topics. This is not at all related to legal, and it's not at all related to filing VA claims. But say a newly diagnosed mesothelioma patient who is a veteran comes to you and also is open to treatment. Is that part of how you help veterans, and what does that entail? And I know there's VA hospitals, there's hospitals that work with VA centers for mesothelioma programs, for doctors, for treatment. How many are there? How accessible is that option for veterans? What does that system look like?
Right.
And how much do you know about that? Because I imagine that there's a lot of veterans that come to you and are open to getting treatment and are trying to cure themselves of this disease.
Right. Well, one of the problems that I see in the veteran community, and this is probably true of non-veterans as well, is that so often a non-mesothelioma surgeon tells the patient that they're not a surgical candidate. And in a lot of cases, it turns out that's not true. Now, in cases where the patient's really too old for surgery or too weak, or the disease has simply progressed to the point where there's no possible way anyone could do surgery, that's one thing. But I find a large portion of the veteran community who are told you're not a surgical candidate for one reason or another, and then once we get them in touch with an actual specialist, they turn out to actually be surgical candidates. So I tell them, listen, anything that a non-mesothelioma specialist tells you about your prognosis, your life expectancy, or your treatment options, take it with a grain of salt. Go see an expert and get an opinion from them before you make a decision as to whether you're eligible for a particular treatment option. So one of the things that I try to make sure that we do is get them in touch with a specialist for their type of mesothelioma, for their cell type, who takes their insurance and hopefully isn't too distant. But the reality is that because there are not that many pleural mesothelioma surgeons and even fewer peritoneal surgeons throughout the country, most patients are going to have to travel. And a lot of times that means you're going to have to get on a plane and fly somewhere. One of the things that we do is we try to make sure that we get them a consult from a doctor without them having to go travel to see that doctor. I mean, traditionally in this country, if you want to get an evaluation from a doctor for a particular treatment option, you're going to have to go make an appointment with that doctor, and they're going to have to see you in the office. If you're having to fly or drive a long distance to get that consult, it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend all that money and time to simply have a doctor take one look at your CAT scan and say, I can't do anything for you, and send you back. So we've cultivated relationships with a lot of the mesothelioma specialists in the country so that they will examine the patient's records and provide that patient with an opinion as to whether the doctor thinks that patient will be a surgical candidate without the patient physically having to be there. That way, at least if the doctor says, come see me, the patient has a reasonable expectation that they're going to end up being eligible for surgery. So if all we're looking for from the doctor at that point is, I don't see anything in your medical records and your scans so far that would preclude us from being able to do surgery, come out here and let's do some additional testing and then see if we can actually do it or not. Mm-hmm. So we save a lot of time and money by getting these consults done without the patient having to physically go see that doctor wherever they happen to be. When they are going to travel, you can imagine if a doctor tells you to come and see them on short notice, those flights are going to be expensive. And so there are programs out there that are meant to either minimize the cost of your flight or outright give you a grant for travel expenses. Mm-hmm. And we'll help people get those as well and try to minimize the cost to them in actually going out and seeing that doctor. And that includes things like discounted hotels, rental cars, and even money for food while you're there. And there are also several organizations that have places that you can stay for extremely cheap near mesothelioma treatment centers. So whether that's the Fisher House at the VA hospital that spouses can stay in while their spouse is receiving treatment there, to simply discounted hotels that offer discounted rates to patients who are staying there for treatment. Mm-hmm. So that's one aspect of what we'll do in terms of trying to make sure that these veterans are getting the best care that they can, the best care that is available to them in the country.
Between filing a VA claim, looking for treatment, working out specifics and intricacies with legal options, it seems like when someone does contact you and when you do kind of form that relationship and you are helping them, and there is kind of that, you form that kind of you guys are going, you and the patient are going forward and you're helping this veteran, that it's pretty regular communication between you and the veteran, that it's pretty regular that you two are going to be talking, or at least you and the veteran, or you and the veteran's loved ones, between filing a VA claim and all the specifics with that, communicating for treatment, making sure that we're lockstep with your legal claim for a lawsuit and what the lawyer is looking at. And that's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. It just seems, it almost seems like you're one of the most important people in a veteran who has mesothelioma, one of the most important people through this process.
Well, I certainly try to be.
And I don't want to build you up in that way, but it's true. I mean, you're basically not a right-hand man, but you're their teammate through this whole process.
I try to act kind of like an air traffic controller in that regard, or sort of like a central hub for them to get all the resources that they need. And so for those things that I can't specifically help them with, and if they need help getting a civilian doctor, and that's not necessarily my area of expertise, then I can put them in touch with our nurse navigator, Jenna Campagna, who is absolutely wonderful at helping patients to find a specialist to actually evaluate them and to treat them. And when it comes to things like these travel grants that some organizations have made available to patients, we can get them in touch with those folks. And so I try to act as kind of a central hub so that regardless of what they need, they can come to me. And if I have it in-house, I can help them personally. If we don't have it in-house, I can direct them to who to go talk to get that expertise.
Carl Jewett, thank you so much for doing this with us. And thank you for joining the Mesothelioma Guide podcast. Again, Carl is a 24-year Navy veteran who held the title of Lieutenant Commander and is now a Veterans Advocate and Veterans Affairs Claims Agent with Mesothelioma Guide. And he speaks to veterans or the loved ones and family members of veterans on a daily basis and helps them navigate through the VA claims process, helps make sure that their VA claims are in sync with any sort of legal claims, and also helps them find the necessary treatment to hopefully cure themselves of mesothelioma. Again, Carl, it was extremely informative, and it was I'm very happy, and thank you for joining.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right.